You are now listening to Protecting Your Nest with board-certified family medicine and obesity medicine specialist Dr. Tony Hampton. For more, visit drtonyhampton.com. Welcome to the Protecting Your Nest podcast. This is really an exciting day because today it'll just be you and me. And sometimes I decide to record an episode where there's no guest because I want to share something that I think is really important. And, just a few days before the recording of this episode, we got the news that one of the favorite low-carb alternative to sugar sweeteners, erythritol, may be associated with harm. So I thought it was important to talk about this topic because so many people in the low-carb community use alternatives to sugar as a way to maybe enjoy some of those foods that I think we all are familiar with, whether it's cake, cookies, or whatever. So whenever these types of studies occur, it's important that we pause for a moment and reflect and use a little common sense before we make any conclusions. I think we all should be scientists. We should all be critical thinkers. We should be skeptical, and we should all pause whenever we hear new information. The worst thing you can do is to have a certain belief system and be so biased towards that belief system that when you hear new information that you just, put on blinders, right? We don't want to put on blinders. We want to honor that research, and we want to make sure that everything that we are doing allows us to pause whenever it's necessary. Now, I'll be honest, I have a little bias myself. Everybody knows I'm a doctor who encourages the low-carb dietary pattern. Rather, that's just low carb, less than 100 grams, 120 grams, all the way down to carnivore. And my true bias is that I tend to be more carnivore than any other dietary pattern because that's the dietary pattern that's most suitable for my body. Now, again, I think that's important to understand that everybody's body is different. And when I am more ketovore, meaning I'm eating less than 10 carbs a day, I tend to do that periodically. And when I do that, let's just give an example. Like the diet doctor has a low carb, chocolate cake, for example. You can look that up, or I have a link in the notes to the video or the podcast. And with that, you're only using dark chocolate, butter, eggs, and vanilla flavor. So, but that doesn't bother my body. So I can enjoy things like that periodically, and it doesn't bother me. So one of the biggest messages, rather you're, coming to this video just to learn about erythritol or, low carb in general, it's important that you listen to your body. Let your body be the best judge, because your body will be the best scientific study you can ever do. And who knew that even a low carb doc or a low carb person can actually enjoy many of the desserts that they've had in the past. And a lot of times, again, going back to the replacements for sugar, like erythritol, it was those types of things that made it possible. But one of the big messages I would say to anybody who's enjoying this episode is really about eating real food more than anything. And so whenever you have a chance to eat real food, you do that first. And that's the way I deal with it in my family. Who knew that my family would, be eating more of a low carb diet after being vegetarians, greater than 10 years ago. For 8 years before that, there was more of a plant-based mindset in my family. And then we found that low carb was a better dietary pattern. So for this episode, and I really appreciate you guys checking this out today, we're going to do a few things. We're going to take a look at the various types of low carb sweeteners you should be considering, the various types of sweeteners that you should be avoiding. And of course, we're going to take a look at the new study that came out. I think it's important that we take a look at it and I'll just give you my, I won't go deep into the study. I just want to give you my overall perspective of it. And then, what should you do as a result of the study? I think at the end of the day, it's always important to have our takeaways. What is it that we need to walk away from when we get new information? And for those who came to the video just to understand what the study is saying about erythritol, I think you can fast forward. If the information about the other types of sweeteners is not something that you're interested in, just fast forward towards the later part of the video, and then you'll be able to get that information just if you're looking just to get my thoughts. And a lot of times that's what I do. I'll hear expert opinion, I'll look at a study, and then I'll use that information to kind of come up with my thoughts. There's others out there who are going to make videos about this. I saw a video with Maria and Craig Emmerich, for example, and I think Dr. Ken Berry made a video, so you may want to check out those videos too, just to get some other opinions that may be helpful as it relates to this topic. So let's think about this idea of protecting our nest. We must be willing, when we're protecting our nest, to add the right things to our body, right? And so we want to add the right stuff, and we want to remove the bad stuff. So sometimes you have to detoxify. Even taking a sauna, getting in a sauna is actually helping to remove toxins for your body. Who knew, right? And then you want to avoid the bad things that harm your body. When I did my training for nutrition and functional medicine at the University of Western States, I was able to learn a little bit about what they call how to restore your gut. Now, again, I had an irritable bowel problem, so I was very interested in how to restore my gut. And they had something called the 5 R's protocol. And in that 5 R's protocol, they talked about, number one, let's remove the things that irritate your gut or stress it out. Let's replace. And that's when you put the right nutrients back into your body. And sometimes, particularly if you hadn't been used to eating ribeye, right, you may have to replace the acid. Some people think that's important, although I think your body will naturally make more acid as you get more exposure. You have to re-inoculate, and that's when you think about bacteria. Now, interesting thing about carnivore and keto is that your gut microbiome will naturally move in the right direction. So I'm not suggesting that you have to take probiotics or prebiotics, but I think that dietary pattern does it for you. But for some people, that's appropriate. You have to repair, because your intestinal lining has to heal, and then you have to rebalance. And that's really about making sure all of your lifestyle factors are in place. So I really loved my functional medicine training because it helped me to big picture conceptualize, well, how are you just going to be healthy? And when you have a gut, as I had, that was very sensitive, it's important that I'm always thinking about what's the right food for my gut so that I can enjoy my day and my life in a way that's helpful. So let's pause and take a moment to just reflect on some of the sweeteners many people have to consider, particularly when they're adopting a low-carb keto carnivore lifestyle. You're thinking about, and mostly a low-carb and keto, because most carnivores are not going to actually use these things. But let's talk a little bit about that. And let's start with the ones that maybe you should be considering. And when you think about sweeteners, there are different types of sweeteners, different categories of sweeteners. One are the natural things that we can use as sweeteners. Then you have artificial sweeteners, and then you have a category called sugar alcohol. So that's kind of how you want to think about the big picture. And of course, things that are natural sweeteners, they tend to be from natural sources like plants and other sources. And examples that you kind of think about are things like stevia, monk fruit, coconut sugar, raw honey, of course, monk, or maple syrup, should I say. So those are the types of things that are more natural. And what's interesting is that some of them are really good for a low carb diet, like stevia and monk fruit, and then others like honey and maple syrup may not be the best thing for a low carb diet. So just because it's natural doesn't mean that it's actually good for that purpose. So always keep that in mind when you're making decisions about which alternative to sugar you're going to consider. And then, of course, you have the artificial sweeteners, which when those were brought to the market, they were very popular because they had less calories and things like that. But you learn over time that there may be some harm potentially with those. You think about sucralose, for example, as an example of one that seems great because there's no calories and things like that, but they tend to have some side effects. I'll touch on a few in a moment, but I think that that's one of the things that make us move away from artificial sweeteners. But in general, if you think about it, I mean, again, our goal is to eat real whole foods. So whenever given choice between a natural sweetener, of course, we're going to choose that over one that's artificial. Even if it's low in carbs or calories, we want to go with the ones that are natural as much as possible. Then you have this other category called sugar alcohols. And that's they're kind of derived from sugar, but they have half the amount of calories in them. So I think that's a category you need to be aware of. Half the amount of calories compared to regular sugar. So you want to know about those. They do have, it is sugar and alcohol. That's why they call it sugar alcohols. But it's not the kind of alcohol that makes you tipsy. So don't get too excited, right? So it's not that kind of alcohol. It's just that you combine sugar and alcohol, and they're very interesting in that, like fiber, they don't really digest very well, and so they kind of act like dietary fiber. But because of that, for some people, they can cause some upset stomach. And of course, erythritol is in that category. There's others like mannitol, sorbitol, and you'll hear of others. But I just want you to get the big category picture. So that's kind of important to kind of lay the landscape of the categories of alternatives to sugar. A concept that's really important. I remember when I wrote my book, Fix Your Diet, Fix Your Diabetes, I did talk about in that book how important it was to just understand the glycemic index. And the glycemic index is important because it's kind of a measure of, how quickly am I going to convert the food I consume in the form of sugar, right, into, how fast it's going to spike my blood sugar, right? So we really don't want to have a lot of spikes. One of the things that leads to better control for a diabetic, for example, is to reduce the spikes, because spikes, they do cause harm. Even if you have enough insulin to kind of lower it back down, it's better to have your blood glucose levels in a more narrow range, whether you're a type 1 diabetic, type 2, or just in general. So I think it's important that we understand which foods will do that and which foods won't. So that's one thing you want to think about when you're choosing a sweetener. And then another concept that is important to understand is net carbs. A lot of times in the low carb community, we'll encourage people to do total carbs, because when you do net carbs, where you're able to subtract the fiber and the sugar, alcohols, and things like that, it does give you more room to maybe have more carbs than you maybe should. But at the end of the day, net carbs is just a concept you need to understand. Again, although I encourage total carbs for most of my patients, some people will say net carbs are fine. You just got to be careful, because if you eat a keto or low carb bread that has, for example, 14 carbs, 13 maybe fiber, maybe some sugar, alcohol in there, you can actually subtract that out and end up with one net carb. But imagine if you eat 10 pieces of bread that are keto, and yet you are saying to yourself, well, it's only 10 net carbs, why should it matter? And I think that's overdoing it, and that's really not the way we want you to eat. And most importantly, as I mentioned earlier, you really want to eat real food. And if you're eating a lot of this processed food, you're really going from eating the standard American diet, and now you're just eating more processed food, although it's keto, and that's really not what we want you to do. We want you to eat real whole foods, eat on the outside of the grocery store where the meat and the non-starchy vegetables live. And if you do that, I think you'll do much better. Now, now let's talk for a moment. So we kind of touched on maybe some things that we should consider. What about the things what kind of natural or artificial sweetener should we avoid, right? And so let's start that conversation. The first thing is we think about the ones with the lower glycemic index, which I mentioned before. You want to do that. And the thing that's funny about these sweeteners, even the things they have benefits, right? Some of these things have benefit. They may have antioxidants in them. They may have other nutrients in them, like honey, for example. But if you're a diabetic or if you're metabolically unhealthy, I mean, think about it. We've said in previous episodes that there's only about 7% of us who are metabolically healthy. So if only 7% of Americans are metabolically healthy, and that may be true in other countries, then why would we then eat things that worsen our metabolic health, that cause hyperinsulinemia, that lead to metabolic syndrome, which is, again, your blood pressure is elevated, your blood sugar is elevated, your belly maybe is rounded than it should be, and you have high triglycerides or low good cholesterol, which is called HDL. So if you have 3 out of 5 of those, why would you then consume even items that are considered healthy, like honey, which is going to raise your blood sugar? So I would say avoid those things so you can move more towards the metabolic health you're seeking. So a couple of examples, and I'll give you a little bit more details. Aspartame, which is something you think about Equal or NutraSweet. Sucralose, which is Splenda, is one you want to be thinking about as ones to avoid. Saccharin, which is sweet and low. And then, of course, there are other things you'll see on the label, like maltodextrin, right? You'll see that on the label. That's a type of carbohydrate as well. And but it's highly processed, and it comes in the form of a white powder. It comes from rice, corn, things like that, wheat, potato starch. Those are ones to avoid. Then there's one called polydextrose. That's also a complex carbohydrate made from glucose. It's also made in the lab, not digested by the body, which looks good on paper, but not to be consumed as much. And then when it comes to those poor metabolic health people, should you be consuming coconut sugar or honey or maple sugar or dates or molasses or agave nectar? And the answer is I would avoid those. If you are doing this rarely, it's probably okay, but all of those things are not exactly good for your blood sugar because they're going to cause spikes. And I would avoid those. Even though they're more natural sources of sugar, I would avoid those because I think that they have the potential to harm people who may be at risk. Now, the good news is that we have meters, right? So if you're a person who needs to monitor this more closely, well, we have meters. So you just pull out your meter after you've consumed a certain food item or a certain alternative to sugar. And what happens in an hour and a half, or 2 hours is all the information you need. So always rely on data to make your decision. Although we're having a broad conversation about this topic, I think it's important that the data that you use be your best guide. You're the experiment that will yield the most results for you. And so do your own experiment and then you'll know. But common sense will tell you if I eat a high glycemic index form of sugar, natural or not, that's going to cause the potential for harm. And then we're trying to avoid being harmed. So if we go back to aspartame, which is the same as like Equal or NutraSweet, that's something that's been around for 35, 40 years or so. And again, it's something that you'll see a lot in drinks and certain foods that that you may find in the middle part of the grocery store. So be careful. But what happens with this particular one, there was a study done in the American Journal of Industrial Medicine that really made us pause, and I'll have a link to that in the notes. And it really it had to reevaluate the current position on that particular source of alternative sugar, and it told us to pause and they considered a public health urgent matter. And they just found that there may be some carcinogenic effects. Now, keep in mind that a lot of these studies, even the study that we're commenting on as relates to erythritol, are observational studies. So they really show a possible association correlation. So you can't really put the full weight of confidence in the study because it's the possible association and correlation. However, what you want to do is say, okay, if I have some alternatives, maybe I need to use a certain level of caution, or you may want to say, I just want to not overexpose myself to a certain substance where there's question marks, right? And the question marks with aspartame were related to some memory performance. And I really need to make sure my mind's working really well. So for me, that's kind of a big deal to make sure my mind's working well. And there's also increased risk based on those studies for oxidative stress. So, and you don't want to, we learned about oxidative stress a lot during the pandemic, right? And we just want to, reduce that as much as possible. And, but more importantly, I call myself the metabolic health doc because I believe that achieving metabolic health is really key to wellness in general. And lo and behold, they found in the studies that aspartame increased the risk. It predisposed our babies to an increased risk for obesity and poor metabolic health. So we really want to be thoughtful as we feed ourselves, feed our babies. Of course, all supplements have potential side effects. The ones common with aspartame were headache, things like migraine, of course, mood disorders, dizziness, and even episodes of mania. So that's pretty interesting. So again, this is in a category of sweeteners to avoid. Again, everybody needs to make their own decision. And for some of us, a periodic exposure is okay. On a regular basis, you need to really rethink that. The second one I wanted to comment on is sucralose. It's also a brand name Splenda. It's a chlorinated sucrose derivative. That seems a little, crazy, right? Yes, chlorine is chlorinated, and we already know that we use that to like sterilize the water, like our pool water, things like that. And it was actually originally developed as an insecticide, interesting enough. And so it really wasn't really designed to be consumed. It reminds me of the old Crisco, the Crisco that we had on our counters we used to cook with back in the day. I think, I don't know, Procter & Gamble, I think, made that. But anyway, when Crisco was originally used, I think it was supposed to be used as oil for oil tankers or something like that, something crazy. And now we're using it for our food. So we have to be careful. People love using this substance, however, sucralose, because it is very potent. It's about 600 times more sweet than sugar. And I want to pause for a moment and think about that, right? A lot of these artificial sweeteners are way more potent than sugar, but 600 times more potent than sugar. And then you wonder why we live in a world where so many people are addicted to that sweet taste, because we've kind of hijacked our taste buds from eating what's natural. I always remember, seeing people who take, sugar cane and they'll just kind of suck on the sugar cane. That type of approach is probably less harmful than taking the sugar cane and converting it to a powder, right? So as you could imagine, having something that's 600 times more potent than sugar can make susceptible people more likely to have addictive tendencies, right? So we have to be really careful and thoughtful and think historically and say, is this normal to take in something that's 600 times more potent than sugar? And sugar is already a concentrated form, a concentrated powder, right? And it's 600 times. It blows my mind when I think about it. Now, for Splenda, in 2014, the Center for Science in the Public Interest, they place Splenda in the caution category, right? And I think that's important when you start seeing large organizations, and even if it's observational data, and they're saying use a little caution because it causes leukemia in mice. And then a study published in the Journal of Toxicology and Environmental Health, talked about how if you cook Splenda at high temperatures, it generated some dangerous, chloropropanol, which are just toxic compounds, and they found that in humans, in another study, that the glucose, insulin, and other hormones were altered in levels in ways that was harmful. So again, most of these studies are observational studies, so use a little caution as you make an assessment. But it's just nice to know that there's data out there that says we should be at least cautiously moving forward. And again, it's another case for eating real whole foods as much as possible. And then let's go to the third one I wanted to add additional commentary on, which is saccharin, which is also known as sweet and low. And man, they found even in the 70s that this one could be associated with bladder cancer. Now that was something that they kind of said, later the FDA said, that's not as bad as we thought. But again, I just want you to have some historical context to know that there was some concern, and that's really a problem. One of the things about this particular sweetener is that there is an association with your sensitivity to light, some nausea, GI upset, and for me personally, I've noticed that a lot of these artificial sweeteners, they can really upset my stomach. But I am a little different in that I have a history of irritable bowel. So what upsets me may not upset you. And of course, there's been studies that associate this particular one with cancer. So that's important. So those are the ones I want to kind of go a little deeper on. I don't want to, I could be talking all day on this podcast about the different types of artificial sweeteners and dive deep. But I didn't want this video to be just about that. I just want to provide high level, big picture view. And so those are the ones we should avoid. Now, I want to be clear. In fact, one of my future guests on the podcast is a guy who makes toothpaste, because there's places where these sweeteners can be hiding. Now, his toothpaste is a little bit more natural, but I think even with any natural or unnatural product, you want to, have an idea of what's in it, right? So we're going to be talking about toothpaste, I think, on the next episode or the episode after that. But so look at the label, because a lot of these artificial sweeteners are going to be hiding even some of the natural ones, and you need to know where they are, which is going to maybe help you choose those instead. Mouthwashes will have them. Our babies may be exposed to it with their vitamins, right? You don't think about it, but chewable vitamins may have these artificial sweeteners in there. Cough syrups, believe it or not. As you know, a lot of the cough syrups, to mitigate the taste of the medicine, they make it a little sweeter. Obviously, chewing gum. In fact, some chewing gums I have to be careful about, because some of the sugar alcohols can bother my stomach. And even though it's just a chewing gum, it may bother me a little bit. A lot of the drinks out there, in the sodas, of course, salad dressings, some of the frozen yogurts, of course, candy will have these things. Many of the baked goods out there, and breakfast cereals, of course, are highly processed, and they add these artificial substances to those. And I think those are the types of things that you need to be aware of. We don't have to go into great detail, but hopefully, so far, I haven't scared you to death of not using any types of, a substitute for sugar. But I do want to pause for a moment and at least share a few that may be better options for you moving forward. And let's start with one that, a lot of people in the low carb community use, and that's stevia. And as you know, stevia is from plant leaves. And I think it's important that we understand that getting something maybe from that source may be better for most of us than something that's made in the lab. And most of the sweeteners I mentioned that are artificial, they're artificial primarily because they were made in a lab. So we want to avoid things that were man created and lean towards things that were kind of naturally found in our environment. But so what's great about stevia is that it has been not associated with not just not raising your blood sugar, but in some cases lowering your blood sugar, which is really odd and interesting. And also there's been studies that show that it improves your cholesterol as well, which makes sense, because one of the things that elevates your cholesterol, from my experience, is inflammation. So if I take in something that's going to not only not cause inflammation in theory, and something that will reduce my sugar burden, all of that sugar and inflammation is what leads to high cholesterol. As your cholesterol is really there to protect you and repair the arteries. So if you're not increasing the glucose burden, you probably could reduce the cholesterol just based on common sense here. But be careful because stevia is really can be highly processed, right? So there are probably brands out there you've heard of like Truvia, Stevia in the raw. They're really highly processed versions of stevia, and they do have better quality stevia out there. So try to really look for something that's less processed when you get to that particular substance. Also, keep in mind that we're talking about, in a moment about erythritol. Well, a lot of times, if you look at the stevia, they'll add erythritol or some other type of sweetener like dextrose to it. So for the most part, you're trying to get a form of stevia that is, less processed, where they haven't added anything as much as possible. We like it because it has, it's really zero on that glycemic index scale. It's really, not much in terms of calories and carbs. So it's really from a low carb keto perspective is a nice option. And going back to what I said about even some of the artificial sweeteners, it's 200 to 400 times more sweet than table sugar. Again, I don't know if that's a good thing to consume things that are that potent. Of course, you don't have to consume a lot, but it's just important that you understand that it is very potent. So, you want to be thoughtful that maybe I long term want to move away from sweeteners in general because and get rid of that addiction to sugar. And I think that's really another big message again in this podcast is it normal to consume something even if it's natural that's 200 times sweeter than sugar? So just keep that in mind. And one of the reasons why they add things like erythritol to stevia is because stevia can be for some people bitter, have a bitter aftertaste. So they'll combine it with erythritol or some other keto, favorite sweetener to get rid of that, to balance the sweetness. So just keep that in mind. But again, if we're trying to just move away from that, we want to be thoughtful. The other one I've always recommended over the years for those who have to have that sweet taste is monk fruit. Again, it's another example of a keto-friendly sweetener that has really a zero glycemic index score, and like stevia, it's more potent than sugar, probably 300 to 400 times more potent than sugar, which is really an amazing thing to hear. But it doesn't really affect your blood sugar levels, and it has 0 calories. That's why it's so popular. So again, stevia and monk fruit are examples of sweeteners that have really been staples in the low carb and keto community. And up to now, and again, we're scientists, so when a study comes out saying it's harmful, it is what it is. But we want to be aware that for now, they seem to be pretty good options. Now, one that I'm becoming more familiar with is allulose, and it also has a low GI score, very popular. In fact, I have several of Maria and Craig Emmerich's books, and a lot of the things, whether it's their protein sparing bread and other recipes. And if you haven't checked that out, check it out. In fact, the Emmerichs are going to make an animated video with me and my wife soon. So check out the YouTube channel, hopefully in the next few weeks or so. Maybe I'd say about 3 or 4 weeks from this episode, we'll try to put something out there. And we may talk about bread. We may talk about, other topics. But so allulose is, so they use that allulose a lot, and I can understand why, because it's really a rare sugar. It's naturally occurring, and again, we're trying to be more natural, and you'll find it in things like figs and raisins, wheat, maple syrup, things like that, maybe even molasses. But it only has like 1/10 the calories of sugar, and like the stevia and monk fruit, it really doesn't affect your blood sugar at all, your blood glucose. It doesn't affect your insulin level. So it's really a great substitute, particularly for diabetics, right? So if you're trying to control your sugar, and again, most people are not metabolically healthy, so don't think because you're not diabetic. I mean, you may still have borderline diabetes and be at risk. So, but that's really a great option. And unlike some of the sugar alcohols, it doesn't really bother people as much in terms of their upset stomach issue that can come with the sugar alcohols, which is really helpful. But if you get high doses of any of these substances, you may still find bloating and and gassiness. So I think you have to be careful in general. Another thing about this substance is that, one of the biggest things we worry about is abdominal adiposity, meaning that you get belly fat. And what they find compared to other sweeteners like erythritol, there's less of that fatty organ fat thing going on called visceral adiposity. So again, it's just another reason that this one should be on your list of ones to consider. Now, historically, as we go to the sugar alcohols like xylitol, and under that category, you have things like erythritol, maltitol, mannitol, sorbitol. Those types of sugar alcohols are very popularized in the low carb community, and they've been popularized because they also measure basically a zero on the glycemic index scale. So that's why they've been popularized. They have 0 calories in most cases, and a lot of the keto-friendly recipes have been using erythritol as an example, and it's really very popular. Now, I personally have not been using sugar alcohols, not because I was afraid of it. It was more because I have an irritable bowel issue. And I knew for sure that if I consumed a sugar alcohol, I was going to be in trouble later in the day. Some people have trouble because they have a little bit of an allergic reaction, and they're just sensitive to it from that perspective. Other people just don't tolerate it because of how it works. But so for me, bloating, gas, and cramping, and sometimes even diarrhea was something that would happen with this particular substance. So I tended to stay away from it. I never really felt it was a good idea for my patients who were pregnant to consider artificial sweeteners or sugar alcohols as much. I think it's better to just go with natural sweeteners. And there's one thing about the sugar alcohols that's interesting. I've never really been a pet owner just because of the nature of where I lived and what was the rules of where you live. But if you're a dog owner, you have to be careful that sugar alcohols can actually be toxic to your dog. Who knew, right? So if you're a pet owner and you're aware of this, I would be careful where you leave your the foods that may have these substances in it. For example, your breath mints and the candy, sugar-free gums, things like that. Be careful around your pets, because I think that you don't want to harm them. And I think it's important that we don't do that. So I think that's enough like high level perspective as it relates to, sugar, alcohols. Let's take a moment. And again, for those who will know that we're near the 40-minute mark of the video and or the podcast. And so we'll know that's where they need to go if they only wanted to hear my thoughts on the erythritol study. So as you know, the study that was, that made the headlines was published in Nature on February 27th of 2023. And whenever these types of studies come out, they make news, right? And we got to be careful, because as a clinician, I consider myself a scientist. I've done research before. I'm going to continue to look toward more research. I have to really pause and understand what's in front of me. So whenever you hear about a research study, the first thing you ask yourself is, what's the quality of the study? Was it, some type of survey study? Did they just look at data? Was it a randomized controlled study where it was like they controlled for, people's eating patterns, their lifestyle? And if you don't know that, then you really can't judge the study as high quality or not being of high quality. So I just want to say that first. Now let's talk about this study, right? So this study was more of a observational study where they pretty much looked at data. So it was not a randomized controlled trial. So the first thing you need to understand about that is, if it's not a randomized controlled trial, it does not show causation, right? In other words, it shows possible correlation, possible association, but it does not show causation. So I'm sure the headlines don't say that, but I need to say it, because if you don't understand that, then you'll walk away from this information and make assumptions about how significant it should be in your life, right? And I would be a hypocrite if I were to judge other studies that said that meat was harmful, right? And it was an observational study. And then I'm saying, well, you shouldn't trust that study, right? So I think on the onset, we should say out loud, this is not a randomized controlled trial. Therefore, it does not show causation. It shows possible correlation, possible association. What does that then mean? That means that we have now a hypothesis. And the hypothesis is that maybe this study is suggesting that erythritol can be harmful in terms of cardiovascular disease. That does not then lead to, that's the end game. What that means is maybe we need additional studies to prove the hypothesis. And that's how you're supposed to look at this. So stop looking at the headlines and realize that here's another piece of information that suggests that we should do additional research. And the good news is that I think they say that in the study itself. So they did the study because they looked at the fact that we didn't have long-term data for these types of sweeteners on cardiometabolic disease risk. Why do we care about cardiometabolic disease? Because the number one cause of death in the country is heart disease, right? So we should be aware of anything that's going to help that or hurt that. So cardiovascular disease is the biggest thing that harms us. So let's make sure we're aware of anything that can increase our risk for that or decrease our risk. So they had about 1,100 patients, 1,157 to be exact, who were going cardiac risk assessment. Now, what I interpret that to mean is that they were entering the hospital because they were being assessed for heart disease. Now, does that mean they were coming into the hospital with chest pain? all it means to me is that these are higher risk people, because the average person is not coming to the hospital to be assessed for cardiovascular risk. So we already know that the group of people involved in the study were already at higher risk for cardiovascular disease in the first place. And that's really important to understand, because maybe that's not who you are. You may be a 30-year-old who does not have high blood pressure, diabetes, and all the risk factors we think about. So what they found in the study is that circulating levels of multiple polyol sweeteners, but especially erythritol, was associated with a 3 years risk for major adverse cardiovascular events. That included death and non-fatal myocardial infarction and stroke. And what they found is that at physiological levels, that erythritol enhanced platelet activity in vitro and thrombosis, which is when you form clots, in vivo. Now, let's pause for a moment and understand what in vitro means and in vivo. In vitro, and think about that T, right? It means that the research was done basically in a test tube. So think T for test tube, on cells and tissues that were removed from the human body when they did the experiment, while in vivo tests are done on like animals, plants, and cells, but they're done, on real living organisms. So in vivo is better than in vitro, but you can gain data from both. So and so what's interesting is, so the first thing about this, we already talked about the fact that it was they looked at data when they did this study of 1,157 people. So the number is large. However, the size of the study, if it's observational, does not necessarily make it comparable to a randomized controlled trial, right? I would prefer 100 people with a randomized controlled trial, which is real research, and use that as a way to measure whether or not something is helpful or not helpful. So just keep that in mind. But they also did something that was interesting. Not sure why the number was small, but they took a smaller study group, and they called it a prospective study. So that means retrospective is looking back at data, prospective is looking forward, following people and looking at data, but it's still just not a real experiment. And they took only 8 people now, and they found that at 2 days, the 8 healthy people, these were healthy people, they saw a marked and sustained increase in the plasma erythritol level. And that level was at a threshold that was associated with heightened platelet reactivity and thrombosis. And as you know, platelets is what keeps us from, like if I cut myself, right, accidentally, the platelets clump together and stop you from bleeding, right? But what you don't want is for platelets to start clumping and reacting and increasing your risk for clots when it's not necessary, other than when you cut yourself, things like that. So 2 days into consuming erythritol, they found that the levels were higher for that to occur. But the problem is it's just 8 people, and it's also just looking at data, and so to then say cause and effect is not possible. Possible association correlation is what they're saying. And so based on the study, they concluded that erythritol was both associated with increased cardiovascular risk and thrombosis. And that's what they found. So again, they found that there was this association in this study. And again, what's interesting, one thing I'll give them is that they did try to make this as high quality of a study, even though it's observational as possible. The fact that they did in vivo and in vitro is really something I applaud them for, because what you do is you try to make your study, even if it's not the best possible. But again, it doesn't show causation. So we even with that, we appreciate that. There's something called the hazard ratio they looked at. which really just, if it's greater than, it was like, 3-fold. Anything over 1-fold is considered good. Anything less than 1-fold is considered not statistically significant. So it definitely met the rules of quality for observational study, but it's still an observational study. So I think we want to be very careful not to make final decisions about any study that is not of the highest quality. You could also argue that the chances that we'll get randomized controlled trials for this type of study is not high. There may be some, some issues around ethics, and is that really a good idea? So we do have to start making some decisions about, what do we do with this information, and that's kind of what I want to kind of conclude with is, how do we walk away from this information knowing it's not the best done study possible, where we still walk away with some lessons learned? And I'll just give you my 2 cents. Again, I want you to listen to other influencers and hear what they have to say. I want you to get the study. I think it's not really available freely. I was able to get it downloaded for about, $9 and some change. Again, nature has to make a living too, but and eventually it'll be available publicly, hopefully. But right now you have to pay for it. So let's talk about, what should you do and walk away from. So let's think about the metabolic health doctor, right? So if metabolic health is, at least by the common definition, looking at your blood sugar, your blood pressure, looking at your waist circumference and your HDL and triglycerides, maybe you need to look at yourself and say, do I have metabolic syndrome where 3 out of 5 of those things are off, right? So if that's who you are, or you could argue, I just have a high blood pressure, or I just have a high blood sugar, or, I'm borderline diabetic or diabetic. Those are probably considered high risk groups, right? So if you find yourself in a high risk group, then you need to pause and take this study more seriously, right? So even though it's only an association, possible correlation, based on the information we have now, you have options, right? And the options would be, either I'm going to rarely consume this sugar because maybe I'm consuming it too much. Because really, if you think about it, in the study, it was really about people who were consuming this every day, right? So if you say, oh, I'm just going to consume it periodically, I'm at, Denny's, and I just want to put some erythritol sweetener in my coffee, maybe that's not so bad, even for a person that's higher risk. But you can then take the other approach, which is, I'm high risk, I'm done with erythritol. That's another approach. So again, this is an educational podcast. We're not here trying to say you have to do it this way or that way. But I do think it would be a mistake to walk away from this study and assume that this hypothesis that this is associated with cardiovascular disease is the takeaway. I think that would be a mistake. I think that it's better to say, man, I need to be thoughtful. I need to think about, or should I consider an alternative? But it's not cause and effect. So that's number one. If you are not at risk, you could argue that this being consumed periodically is probably not going to be a big deal. I'm not sure I would just go crazy and eliminate it. If you're in a low risk category, you don't have metabolic syndrome or anything like that, and you're just trying to just have awareness. And I think for either category, just having awareness that there's an issue is really important. The good news is there are so many other options, and we talked about those options. Again, we mentioned things like stevia and monk fruit. We want to be pure, and we want to consider allulose as well. So I'm kind of putting those as my top 3 now. And then we'll kind of keep our eyes on the sugar alcohols moving forward. Again, I don't really need to worry about sugar alcohols because my body just can't tolerate it. But if you're one who tolerates it, now you have that additional information to make your decision. Another thing I want you to be thinking about is how so many people suffer from sugar addiction, right? So we talked about how potent these sugar replacement substances are. And if you are concerned that you're not going to be able to tolerate the 2 to 300 and 400 times more potent sugar alternatives, why would you do that to yourself when you know you got a little sugar addiction issue, right? So I think it's better to start thinking about the big picture, which is, does it really make sense to consume substances? I don't care if they're the good stuff or the bad stuff that predispose me to wanting more of those things. I would argue that's not the best place moving forward. Although I also believe that life is to be enjoyed. So if I have a keto friendly cheesecake periodically, and I tolerate those sweeteners, that should be okay. But the bigger theme is, let's eat real food. Let's move towards real food as much as possible. And if I'm at risk for sugar addiction, I think that I need to use a certain level of caution. Now, when I listen to people I respect, like Dr. Eric Westman and others, one thing that he'll say is that these replacements, these 0 calorie, 0 carb, 0 glycemic index sweeteners are great for transition. So they're great for bridge therapy. In other words, as I'm transitioning away from this palate that's so addicted to sugar, this may be a good way to do it, where you're not hurting your sugar so much, and you're able to also get that sweet taste that we all love. So I think that's another way of looking at it. Consider it your transition, substance, as opposed to something you're going to do long term. And so in general, I think the theme is, let's use these substitutes sparingly, but feel free to use them periodically, particularly if you have kids. I think about the Emmerichs, and over the years, they've been able to put some wonderful keto-friendly recipes together. And maybe what you'll do is, if you're worried about erythritol, you'll say, well, maybe I'll lean more towards allulose or stevia or monk fruit, pure for the latter two. And what that'll do is allow you to still enjoy those things, but maybe with a substitute that you'll prefer. And one thing I like about the Emmerichs is that their books they teach you how to, if you use this version versus that version, it'll show you how to make that adjustment, because the amount, like for example, even though this is not a sugar substitute, coconut versus almond flour, right? So there's different ways you may have to use less coconut flour versus the almond flour. So there's ways to adjust for those things as well. So, and another thing I want you to understand, I mentioned this earlier, as you get away from the addictive need for these substances, you'll then be able to eat a strawberry and taste the sweetness in the strawberry, because you're not eating that 2 to 400 times more potent sugar alternative, and you'll then be able to restore your taste buds. So that's another thing to be thoughtful about, because that's kind of how I have found it worked in my life and in my family. So get away from that addictive tendency. So now let's think about the big picture, right? So a lot of people say, Doc, I can't imagine a life without these sweet things. I just can't imagine it. And I hear that sometimes, particularly from my diabetics. They'll say, I can't imagine not having sugar in my diet, right? And but what I say to them is, I totally get it. I think we all have these addictive tendencies, but let's compare that to the alternative, right? Imagine, having tingling in your fingers and numbness in your fingers. Could you imagine living with that, right? Imagine going to see the eye doctor, and they're saying, there's something called diabetic cataract, believe it or not, diabetic glaucoma. And many of you have heard about diabetic retinopathy, all related to too much glucose floating around in your blood. Imagine, could you imagine not living with that, right? And or not living with the fact that when you go see your doctor, and every time you see them, they're like, oh, it looks like you got a little protein in your urine. We measure microalbumin, or it looks like your creatinine is elevating, and imagine not living with the doctor having to warn you that your kidneys are at risk for failing and you'll end up with diabetes. Imagine, thinking about relatives that you have who maybe have suffered from a heart attack or stroke and they were diabetic or, were metabolically unhealthy. And imagine not having to spend most of your days worrying about when is it my turn, right? So I definitely understand why people struggle and can't imagine what it's like to not have that sweet stuff in their lives. But I can also tell you from my experience, it is so much better to start to move away from these types of substances. And I want you to imagine what that strawberry is going to taste like once you do that. It's going to taste really good. So, because you're going to taste the sweetness in that strawberry. And even going back to what I said about the diet doctor, one of the low carb cakes that we make from that website, which doesn't really have any sugar or flour in it, it's just eggs and butter and dark chocolate and vanilla flavor. Who knew that something with dark chocolate, and I'll be honest, I'll throw a little whipped cream on top sometimes, that would taste sweet to me. Who knew? But that's what happens when you restore your taste buds and you don't rely on any sweetener. Rather, it's the good ones like stevia, monk fruit, the pure versions, and allulose, or the ones that we have more caution about now. We have to kind of, unfortunately, throw erythritol into that category potentially. And then, of course, the artificial sweeteners that we talked about earlier. And of course, the ones that are natural, like honey and molasses. So this is what happens. You move away from the things that potentially harm you, and you move towards the things that that can help you. So what I tell anybody who hears my voice in clinic when I'm speaking at the Symposium for Metabolic Health or other conferences, or friends and family, patients, the old you needs to get out of the way to make room for the new you. And the new you is going to hear information, acquire that knowledge, be rational, stop looking at the headlines, and you're going to make a decision that's best for you and your family. That's what I try to do in my life. That's what I want you to do. And at the end of the day, this is just another piece of information that you'll now use to make some decisions. But no matter what decision you make about erythritol or any other additive, just try to move towards real foods 99% of the time. And what you do 1% of the time will probably not cause any harm. So I hope this message, this podcast was helpful. I hope it provides some perspective, some things to think about. If you learned anything or if it made you think a little bit differently, please share that in the podcast comments or if you're watching this on YouTube, in the YouTube video notes. That way, other people will join the conversation and learn from you as well. We're all in this together. We're all trying to navigate these choppy waters that are very confusing. But again, it'll be less confusing if we understand what we're reading, what we're understanding, so we can make better decisions. So I really appreciate you guys for tolerating me today on the Protecting Your Nest podcast. We'll get some guests on for our next episode. And until we have a next episode, continue to be safe, be well, and continue to protect your nest. You've been listening to Protecting Your Nest with Dr. Tony Hampton. For more, visit drtonyhampton.com.